Hi everyone, and welcome to Scicomm Monday. I'm your host, Nicole Wood. For those of you who are new to the broadcast, we try to make this as engaging a platform as possible, so please feel free to send in any of your questions or comments via the integrated chat module here on Periscope. And then for those of you who are watching this on replay, definitely feel free to send in your questions to us via our various chat handles. So you can reach me either at the Scicomm Monday handle or at my personal handle, Wildlife BioGal. Today we are really excited to be talking with Ellen George. She's from Cornell University. She's a PhD student there, and she's going to be talking to us all about the Great Lakes Cisco restoration that she's been doing with her research. And so she goes by the handle of, it doesn't really take a lot to figure this out, but at Great Lakes Cisco. So with that, I'd love to thank Ellen for being on the broadcast and welcome you to the show. Thanks for being here, Ellen.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I'm really excited to talk Cisco science with you today.
Yeah, no, it's great to be on, and I'd like to say thank you to you, not only you, but to everyone out in the broadcast for being a little patient with us as we started late. It's one of the fun things with this platform is we really are riding on that wave front of technology, and it's always fun when you're trying to get everything keyed up, and all of a sudden something says, oh, there's an error, we can't use this program, and so you're constantly having to reinstall right before the broadcast.
You're too high-tech for our own good.
I'm too high-tech for my own good.
You are.
Yeah, for Titus, if you're out there watching, no, it wasn't you having issues, it was us. But for everyone out there, yes, I mean, it's a great, yes, Cisco Science with Titus out there, great that you could join us. So, yeah, so why don't you just kind of give us a little bit of background about what Cisco are, who you are, and just kind of bring us all up to speed so that way we can start asking some in-depth fun questions later in the broadcast.
Sure. So like Nicole said, my name's Ellen, and I am a PhD student at Cornell University, and I study Cisco in the Great Lakes and in Lake Ontario in particular, which is our neighborhood Great Lake here in upstate New York. So Cisco are a schooling cold water prey fish that are native to the Great Lakes. So that means that they like to live in cold water. So they live deep down in the lake in the summer, below the thermocline in the cold water down deep, and they are schooling. So they group together in big schools, and they are a prey fish, which means that things like to eat them. So the major predators that prey on Cisco are lake trout, Atlantic salmon, and then some of the other large, big fish that we like to catch. So several salmon and trout species. So that's why we're interested in them here in the Great Lakes. They used to be incredibly abundant in the Great Lakes, and they were one of the most abundant fish in the region, and they actually supported a really big commercial fishery. So back in the 1800s and early 1900s, they were one of the largest fisheries in the Great Lakes. But unfortunately, overfishing and habitat degradation led to their populations collapsing all across the 5 Great Lakes by about the 1950s. So status of Cisco right now in the Great Lakes is in Lake Superior, they still have a small commercial fishery going. But in the rest of the lakes, they're either really low numbers or they're disappeared. So Lakes Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Ontario have very low numbers of Cisco, and then they're completely disappeared from Lake Erie. So the reason that we are working on Cisco restoration, and I'm studying Cisco restoration, is that we want to bring them back.
Great. Yeah, so is there a lot of push from the fishermen and everything to bring Cisco back? Is it something that they're really keen on doing, or is it just more of the scientists saying, hey, this is something that used to be here, we'd like to see it come back because it would be good for the health, but is there a lot of like public support with bringing them back?
That's a great question. So it does depend on where you are and what lake you're on. So certainly in Lake Superior, the fishermen are very interested in the status of cisco and making sure that we have a healthy cisco population, because they are still an important commercial fish species in Lake Superior. So the fishermen are much more aware of the cisco population and the problems we have with cisco. But in some of the other lakes, there's not as much knowledge about them. Like, a lot of people have either stopped fishing for them or completely forgotten that they exist altogether. So lakes Michigan and Superior are lucky because people still know about cisco and they still fish for cisco there, not just commercially fish for them, but recreationally fish as well. So Lake Michigan actually has had a lot more recreational fishing for cisco in the past few years. So there's a little bit more of a push from the recreational commercial fishermen there. But in some of the other lakes, it's mostly driven by the scientists simply because we haven't had cisco for so long. So like in Lake Erie and then in Lake Ontario, we've had a very long cultural disconnect with cisco. So up in the upper lakes, people can still remember eating cisco or fishing for cisco, or even if it's not them, maybe their parents or grandparents can remember that. But down here in the lower lakes, our fisheries for cisco collapsed over 100 years ago. So there's a really big cultural disconnect between the fish and the people. So a lot of people here have never heard of a cisco, and or any of their other names. They have many names. So we call them cisco here, but they're also known as lake herring, mostly up in Lake Superior, and they're also called tullibee, which is probably my favorite common name for them because it's a very entertaining name, and that actually is from a Native American word, ontonabee, and transliterated into tullibee. But here we call them cisco. And so down here in the lower lakes, it's mostly a push by the scientists because we're interested in their role in the food web. So cisco are a prey fish species, which means that lake trout and Atlantic salmon like to eat them. But our lake trout and our Atlantic salmon populations are not doing too good down here. And one of the reasons is because mostly what they're eating is invasive species such as alewife and rainbow smelt. So alewife and rainbow smelt are not native to the Great Lakes. And in some of the lakes, like Lake Ontario, they make up over 90% of the prey fish in the lake are these invasive species. So the trout and salmon are eating these invasive species. And unfortunately, alewife and rainbow smelt are really high in an enzyme called thiaminase. And thiaminase breaks down thiamine, or vitamin B1, in the bodies of these big fish. And this can lead to reproductive failure because the little larvae in their eggs are, because their parents had these high thiaminase enzyme in their bodies, they have a thiamine deficiency. And then they don't make it after they hatch. So we're hoping that by restoring some of these native prey fish species like cisco, which are very low in thiaminase, will give the lake trout and Atlantic salmon an alternate food source to eat, and hopefully they'll grow big and healthy, and they'll have big healthy babies that survive past the first few days. So down here, we're really interested in their role in the food web and bringing them back to try to strengthen that food web and build some resiliency into the food forage base.
Yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff there that you're talking about, because I live near Lake Michigan. You know, my hometown is a little bit over an hour away from Lake Michigan. Until I ran into you, I had never heard of cisco. It's like, because of you and the Scicomm that you've been doing, like I was like, oh, that there's this fish out there. It's, I do, my work is in, the coastal wetlands of the Great Lakes. I deal with fish and things out there. And so the fact, like, I hadn't heard of them was like, oh my goodness, there's this really cool fish that I've never heard of. And it can have like such a big impact in the Great Lakes ecosystem. It's like, why aren't more people hearing about this? I mean, if it's that important that it's, impacting those species further up that food chain, more and more people really should know about this and be like supportive of like the work to bring these fish back.
Yeah, it's really interesting how it's just been so long since they've been a major part of the food web in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. People they've never heard of them and they don't think about them really. So getting just awareness of Cisco out is to the public is a really big reason why, a really big driver behind our science communication and outreach efforts, because we can go and try to do a presentation on Cisco, but people have never even heard of them here, so that was a big hurdle. And I was recently up in Wisconsin for the Coragonid Symposium, which was great, meeting of all of the Cisco and whitefish minds from around the world. And I haven't spent a lot of time up in the Lake Superior area, but it was just wonderful being up there because there they have much more of a cultural connection with Cisco because people still actively fish them there. So it was just so nice being in an area where like everybody knew what they were. I didn't have to explain what I studied all the time. People knew what they were and they knew why they were important, and they were really interested and invested in making sure that the population was healthy and that we were doing what we could to bring them back. So it's definitely two different paradigms, but it was really exciting for a Cisco biologist to be in a place where people knew what you were doing.
It's always, I know that's like, a fun thing with me when I say like, I work with mute swans. People know what a swan is around here, but they just don't necessarily know the difference between the various species of swans that we have here in the Great Lakes, and having to explain that, it's always so nice and refreshing when someone's like, oh yeah, that's that invasive one. I was like, wait, what? You know that?
We've succeeded.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit more about that conference and everything. Like how, like, is it, multi-day symposium or conference? What all goes into that? How many scientists you have actually going and talking about, those fish? It's like, how widespread is this in the science community of people studying Cisco?
Sure. Well, it's really, the numbers are growing very quickly. Number of scientists that are studying Cisco, which is really exciting. Even just a few years ago when I started my master's research. So I'm a PhD student right now, but I started out doing my master's also working on Cisco. So about 5 years ago was when I first started to work on Cisco in Lake Ontario. And there were a lot fewer scientists working on Cisco then. But just in the last 5 or 10 years, especially the last 5 years, it's really kind of ramping up across the Great Lakes Basin. I think people are really starting to realize how important Cisco are and how important it is to build strong native fish communities and not just rely on basically a food base of just invasive species. So people are starting to get interested in studying Cisco, and there's a lot more funding and opportunities to start researching Cisco and other native coragonids, which are the group of fish that Cisco are in, and that also includes bloater and like whitefish. So the meeting was in Bayfield, Wisconsin, and it was a week long, and there were 150 Cisco scientists from all around the world. So we had people from the US and Canada, some from Alaska as well, which is in the US, but it's just unusual to have Alaska fish scientists come down to a Great Lakes fish meeting. And then
I mean, those systems are so far apart, you don't necessarily always cross-pollinate, with, scientists, going to, those same meetings. It's, especially when it's something,
exactly.
It seems that it can be like more regionally based. To have someone come down to be a part of that is always really good and exciting to get their input.
Exactly. Yeah. So then we also had several people from Europe, from Russia, Finland, Sweden, Norway. So there was a good represenation of the circumpolar Cisco research group.
Wow, nice.
Yeah, it's really great. And we have about half of the talks from that conference were recorded and archived on YouTube. So if anyone's interested in looking at some of the talks from that, they're on our YouTube channel, and you can find that link on my Great Lakes Cisco Twitter page. So
great.
It's right there.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. I know that's one of the things that sometimes it's always so rough if you aren't able to make it to a conference for whatever reason, if it's funding or you're sick or a family emergency or you're in the middle of your field season, you're not able to make it to the conference, it's always nice if you can go back and watch that. And so that's a really great thing that you guys were able to do. I know you did a lot of putting things up on Periscope as well.
Yes.
So that was great to be able to like watch some of those live. I know I tuned into a few of them. I didn't have time to watch them all. You never have enough time to watch everything you want to. So.
Yeah, it was really great to be able to share that with people who weren't at the conference, and then also to people who aren't in the science community that are interested in learning about them. So I feel like so much of what our presentations that we give as scientists are just within the science community, and there are other people that are interested in hearing about that. So even though you have to sit through a science PowerPoint, which isn't always the most accessible format of a talk, it's still nice for people who aren't scientists to be able to access that knowledge and not just wait for it to come out in a few years in a newspaper article or something.
Yeah, because by the time it gets to the paper, you have to go through us doing the research, then us talking about the research at a conference, to us actually publishing it to like a news organization actually picking up on it from that journal article, and then finally getting it out to the public. So it can take a really long time for the research to actually reach the public in a way that they can access it and understand it, fairly easily.
Yeah. So if there's if there's general public people watching that are interested in seeing what some Cisco science talks are like, that would be a good place to look.
Yeah, for sure. And if we'll have to make sure that we retweet out that link for everyone through the Scicomm Monday channel as well, so we can let everyone know about it. Because you know me, we love anything that has to deal with live broadcast stuff. So if we can share that with everyone, we definitely will, for sure.
Very true, yeah.
So just a reminder for everyone out there in Periscope land, if you have any questions for Ellen or myself during the broadcast, please feel free to submit it through the integrated chat module here on Periscope, and we'll do our best to answer the questions. If we don't see it come through, definitely feel free to resubmit it. There's a gazillion things going on behind the scenes, so we don't always catch everyone's questions as they come in. So submit it multiple times until we actually answer. And if somehow we just don't catch it, or you're watching this on replay, please feel free to tweet us at our various handles, and we'll do our best to answer your questions that way. So let's talk about some of your science communication efforts. Since we were talking about reaching out to scientists but also public, what has been some of the best ways that you've found with doing outreach when it comes to Cisco, not only informing other scientists but also the public as well?
Sure. So I started this Twitter account, Great Lakes Cisco, for our research project because we wanted to, raise awareness about Cisco. So this kind of began when we were thinking about how we were going to do some successful outreach to communicate what we were doing on this project to the people who need to know, the fishermen, the anglers, and everyone who has a stake in Cisco in the Great Lakes. So originally we were our grant. I'm funded by New York Sea Grant, and New York Sea Grant requires that people on the grant do some sort of outreach activity. So we were originally planning to do kind of the standard fisheries biology outreach model, which is you do science for about 6 years, and then at the end of the 6 years you go out and you do one 45-minute PowerPoint presentation at a local sportsman's meeting or state of the lake meeting, which are usually filled with either commercial fishermen or charter captains. And I was just thinking, man, none of these guys are going to know what a Cisco is. And you show up to all the charter captains who really just want to hear about Chinook. And I'm going to say, sit down for 45 minutes while I tell you about these fish you've never heard of, and then disappear forever. So I didn't really want to do that. Because we started thinking about the major problem is that, especially down here in the lower lakes, people have never even heard of a Cisco. So I was trying to start to come up with ideas of ways that we could try to build interest and knowledge about the project while the project was actually happening. So not just at the end in one, dumping one presentation on the public, but as we were doing the project, try to raise some interest and awareness of Cisco, so that at the end there would be more people who really were interested to find out what we ended up finding out. So I started the Twitter account for Great Lakes Cisco, and it's just been a really great experience. I'm really glad I did it. not only with connecting with the public, but also connecting with other scientists and researchers around the Great Lakes, and collaborating with them and sharing. So that's our goal for the project. And I run our Twitter account, and then anything else that we might put out, like blog posts or podcasts or things, are going through New York Sea Grant, so through their channels, Facebook pages, and blogs and websites.
Yeah, it's one of the things I'm really glad to see that you did was, created an actual account just for Great Lakes Cisco. I think, a lot more research projects out there could really benefit for doing something like that. I know some folks have done hashtags for their work, which has worked really well, but I also like the idea of just having that actual account that people can like tweet at and interact with, and not necessarily just the hashtag itself.
Yeah.
Have you seen like many other projects that have done that, where they've created the actual account name for the research project, or are you mostly still just seeing hashtags?
I'd say I mostly see just hashtags, and I think there's benefits to both. When we started my account, it was definitely focused on, like, our goal was like, this is the project's account. Like, obviously there's my own personality and things that go through it, because I'm the only person running the account, but and I, people know who I am, and it's not a faceless account, I guess is what I should say. Like, they know it's Alan George at Great Lakes Cisco. So, but I don't, but it's still, everything is about the project. So it's really focused on communicating about Cisco science, and also aggregating other Cisco science posts. So I'm lucky enough to be following many other Cisco scientists around the world, several of whom I met at the conference. And so I also kind of see myself as an information aggregator. So every time they are posting their own research about Cisco, I make sure to share it and retweet it. So it's like a one-stop shop for all your Cisco updates.
Hey, no, that's great to have. I mean, you need that sometimes, because I know, like, we started that Great Lakes Sci hashtag to try to, aggregate everyone's Great Lakes science into one spot. But it is like, you need those areas and locations within social media that you can be like, okay, I can go here to get, this particular information, rather than having to just search and search and search for everyone's stuff. Like, you're already doing it for everyone. You're basically becoming that news source and saying, here's all the important things, just come here and we've got you covered.
Exactly, right? All Cisco, all the time, all in one place. Yeah, I think like the nice thing about the hashtags are that more people can contribute, and it's a little bit more casual. Mm-hmm. But it is more difficult to follow a single hashtag than it is to follow an account, because you have to actively look for that hashtag. Like, you actually have to actively say, I wonder what's been posted on Great Lakes Sci recently. Whereas if you're following me, you get it whether you want it or not. Which
I like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's a good way to put it. I really like that. Yeah, because you're going to get it no matter whether you want to or not, for sure. So, which I mean, it's good, because then it's always fresh on everyone's mind, because sometimes we always get so busy with things. I know myself, like, I feel like even on my days off, like, I'm scrambling around doing all this other stuff, and it's just trying to keep track of everything. It's just a fun thing with so many balls in the air. So if I can have someone that's like there with that flashlight, flashing back and forth, saying, hey, pay attention over here, then I'm like, oh, yes, okay, yeah, rather than like, all right, I knew there was something I'm supposed to remember and think about, but like, I can't, so it's nice. So we got a question coming in from Titus here. Could Cisco biology get in the way of Cisco restoration? It says no big year class equals no Cisco restoration. So
yes. That is an excellent question, Titus. And that's kind of something that we are dealing with in Ontario now. So we recently, I should start at the beginning. When I started doing my project 5 years ago, we had so few Cisco coming back to Chameau Bay, which is the main spawning aggregation that we have in Lake Ontario. There's two known spawning locations. One is on the American side in Chameau Bay, and the second is on the Canadian side in the Bay of Quinte. So I do most of my work on the American side in Chameau Bay, and we would go out there and we were trying to get Cisco for broodstock to send to the hatchery so they could make a lot of little baby Cisco and put them back in the lake. and we were just struggling to get 30 fish. Like all we needed was 30 fish, and it would just take days and days and days, and sometimes we wouldn't hit our target. And it was mostly these older fish that were coming back. So we hadn't had a really good new year class of fish. And what I mean by a good new year class of fish, for those of you who aren't fisheries biologists, is when all the fish in a certain age group that are juveniles make it to adulthood and come back to spawn. So a lot of times they spend a few years, in many fish species, they'll spend a few years growing, maturing before they become adults and then come back to the spawning grounds and actually start spawning with the rest of the population. So we hadn't seen that happening, though. We only had these same old fish coming back. But 2 years ago, we started to see some little new fish coming back. And then last year we had a really big recruitment event, and we had tons of these little 3-year-old fish coming back to spawn. So that was really exciting. So we had one really good recruitment event and a really good year class of fish coming back. But our project would definitely be a lot more difficult if we hadn't had that, because now we have a lot of fish, whereas before we didn't. And we can try to find out as much as we can about the spawning population, but so much of it is up to the actual fish itself. Like, we were trying to figure out where they were spawning. We're trying to figure out if the eggs were surviving, if the larvae were surviving, you know, how this population was doing with very few fish. And then you can try to find out as much as possible. Okay, we found out they like to spawn on rocks, and we found out that they do a little better in years where we have really good ice cover on the lake, because that really protects the area where the eggs are. Or we found out that they do really well in years where there's, you know, more food for them to eat when they're babies, etc. But unless all of those factors line up, you can know all that information, and unless nature actually does all that stuff, the fishery can still disappear. So I think that's one of the big challenges with Cisco, because Cisco classically have this kind of boom and bust year class strength cycle. So they'll have like 1 or 2 years of tons of fish, really good conditions, lots of fish coming back into the fishery, and tons of fish coming back to spawn. And then for some reason, and we're not really sure why, for several years after that, there'll be almost no fish coming back. So it's called boom and bust, because there's really good years and really bad years, really good and really bad. And we're hopefully starting to pick apart some of the reasons why that may happen, but it still doesn't mean that we can control them, and it makes it really difficult to manage a fishery when it's doing that. So hopefully this our work in Chameau, and then the work that other people are doing across the Great Lakes, will help us figure out what factors are going to contribute to that boom and bust year cycle, and then maybe we can figure out if some of those factors are things that we can control, like if they're like maybe the availability of rock spawning habitat for them to lay their eggs on, or you know, or the availability of food is something that we probably couldn't control, or the water temperature in winter is something we couldn't control, but habitat we could, or maybe the number of fish that are being taken out by fishermen, that's something that we can control, and then use those to our advantage.
Yeah, to go on the whole boom and bust thing, do you think that if the fishery was more robust, if there was, you know, a larger population of Cisco, that you'd be seeing so much of that boom and bust? Do you think maybe because the population is still kind of suppressed from all that, you know, overfishing back, you know, 50 years ago, that you're going to be seeing these huge, you know, drivers, you know, impacting it, like, you know, up and down constantly until you can level out the population a little bit more?
At least reading the old literature back when there were more fish around, it seems like even when there were a lot of fish in the lakes, they still did go through these boom and bust cycles. But the difference was then the population was large enough that it could kind of absorb those impacts. So in a really bad year, you know, maybe there weren't a lot of new fish coming back, but there were still a lot of fish left in the general population. So the population was able to absorb and recover from these big boom and bust years better than it is now. And so now that the population is really low, we never know if maybe one bust year is one bust year too many, and the population could disappear. So I think it has a little less resiliency built into the population now, and we'll need to get several good year classes to build up a larger population in order to get to a level where it can absorb those changes like it used to.
Titus, came in with another question here. So about Lake Michigan restoration, and there's a lot of talk about form and genetics. And what is your take on that?
Yeah,
I'm assuming you know all of what he's talking about when it comes to that, because I do not.
Yes, Titus is another Cisco nerd, so he's asking me the real tough questions and wants to see me squirm. I can tell.
Yeah, he must have been like, I saw him, retweeting a whole bunch of stuff before the broadcast and everything. So he must have just been sitting there like for like a day, just going, wah, ha, 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 ha.
I can't wait to come up with the really hard questions to ask Ellen. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a huge question right now that a lot of people have very different and some very strong opinions on. So those of you who aren't embroiled in the world of Cisco drama, like Titus and I, so Cisco are a very diverse group of fish across the Great Lakes, and that has led to a lot of frustration with Cisco. I see your evil laugh.
I know, I've seen it too. It's making me laugh over here. I'm trying not to, especially when I'm off camera, just to randomly start laughing. But Titus has definitely got me going. Oh, good one, Titus.
So Cisco are an incredibly diverse group of species, and the way that they adapted in the Great Lakes. So the North America used to be covered by big glaciers in the last ice age, and as the glaciers retreated, the ancestors of Cisco began to move up and follow the glacier as it retreated. And as they did that, they separated out into little pockets that would later become the individual Great Lakes, but also inland lakes across North America. And in each of these little pockets, they adapted locally to the conditions in those lakes. So because of that, they're all very similar, but they tend to look slightly different everywhere they are. And in some cases, they seem to adaptively radiated out into different species. And in some cases, they look like they might still be the same species, but they look slightly different. And so it's been very confusing for Cisco biologists since we started studying them. So there's a classic paper on Cisco from the early 1900s. It's by Walter Keltz, and he described over 27 species of Cisco in the Great Lakes. Just based on the fact that they looked so different among all the different lakes he went to. So today, a lot of the Cisco scientists are trying to figure out how many of these species are actually really different species, and how many of them are just subspecies or just different morphs of the same overarching Cisco species. And the reason we're interested in that is because as we're starting to restore them, we're trying to figure out, one, what species do we even have left? Because we can't always even agree on what species we have left. Two, if we do find certain pockets of these rare species left, do we need to be focusing on restoring those separately, or focusing on maybe the rarer ones? And then the third question is if we have areas where we want to stock Cisco, like for restoration, one of the major ways to do fish restoration is to grow fish in a hatchery and then stock them back into the lake where you're interested in building the population back up. Do we need to be careful about making sure we choose the correct form or the correct subspecies of Cisco? Because does that represent a species that is specifically adapted to these conditions, and so if you put it in a different lake, it won't do as well? Or does it not matter and they're all the same anyway, and we just dump whatever we have into whatever lake? So because Cisco restoration is ramping up across the Great Lakes, these are some really important questions, because we don't want to just go about doing random things, whatever we feel like. We want to make sure we do something informed. So there's been a lot of work recently about looking at the different morphs or forms of Cisco and then trying to pair that with genetics to figure out if these really are separate species or if they aren't, and it's still a big question. And I think there's some really good work coming out of Trevor Kravenhoff's lab, who's also on Twitter, that is looking at trying to get at that, like how much of these differences in morphs represent different species or just slightly different local adaptations.
Yeah, no, those are a lot of really good points there. Like, I think sometimes we kind of forget when we're, not working with a particular species, how many different like subspecies there can be to something that we just see, oh, it's just Cisco, or, say in my case, oh, it's just a mute swan, like how much variation goes into that, and, like the little impacts, like, it might not even be just like, will that fish do as well in that lake, but what impacts could that, different subspecies possibly have on other species that are native to that lake?
Exactly.
It might eat, one particular thing a little bit more or not. So,
yeah.
Solomon came in and asked, he's like, can species or morphs recombine into one species, do you think? So
yes, they can. So that's one of the issues actually is in areas where you have two different morphs or two different species of Cisco and they're both at really low numbers, they can in some cases interbreed, and in some cases the more abundant one will kind of take over that population and breed out the less abundant species. So a good example of this is Cisco and bloater in Lake Huron. So Lake Huron used to both have both large populations of Cisco and bloater, which are similar to Cisco, but they live much deeper in the lake. But they look very similar to Cisco, and then they're in the same genus. So they're not the same species, but they're in the same genus. So they're closely related. What scientists think happened is as both populations got lower and lower and lower and lower, there were less available fish to breed, and they started interbreeding. And then the bloater and Cisco basically disappeared, and now you have what scientists think are a hybrid between the two. But there's no longer two functioning species in the lake. There was just one. A lot of times these inbred species can be less well adapted to the lake, and they actually suffer more effects from changing conditions than they would if they remained separate species. So that's something that is a concern in a lot of areas where the populations are getting low. And it's also a concern in areas where fisheries managers are thinking of stocking fish that might come from another lake, because you don't want to stock some fish that came from another lake that have different genetics, and then for some reason they do better than the native ones, and then they just breed them all out, and all you're left with are the hatchery ones. So these are the tough genetic questions that a fisheries manager has to make, and you have to balance the need to know as much as you can to make an informed decision versus having to just eventually do something. Like, you can't just we also, on the other side of the coin, is we can't just sit around just asking academic questions all the time without, going and doing something. So we're constantly having to juggle, as fisheries managers, constantly having to juggle those two sides of the coin.
Yeah, that's a lot of interesting points there. And Solomon made a quick, comment in there, which, brings me to something else. He's like, usually you're out stalking fish rather than just stocking them. So why don't you kind of go and talk to us a little bit about the process of doing your research? Like, what do you do when you're out there on the lake? I know we've got this really cute photo of all of you out there looking like you actually are stalking these fish. So why don't you walk us through your actual, day in the life kind of thing of when you're going out and doing your research?
Sure. I love that photo. I call that my National Geographic photo because I'm saving it for when we're on the cover of National Geographic.
It totally is. It looks like it's got the lighting and everything for National Geographic for sure.
Yes. That was taken by Matt Levine from the Nature Conservancy, who was a biologist that was working with me for several years on this project. And that was actually from the first year that we studied Cisco, and we were trying to figure out where they were spawning in the lake. So we knew we knew from talking to some local perch fishermen that they had started catching cisco in Chameau Bay in the fall. And by fall, I mean November, December time, when they were out fishing for perch. And so we thought maybe they might be spawning somewhere in Chameau Bay. So we decided we had to figure out where, and we had no idea where to start. So we ended up catching some cisco and attaching some radio tags to their dorsal fins, and these radio tags send out a radio signal, and each one has a unique signal for each individual fish. And then we tracked those fish around the bay with a big radio antenna. And unfortunately, these cisco spawn late November, early December, and that tends to be about when it starts getting pretty icy, starts getting pretty cold, and about halfway through our radio tracking experiment, the entire bay froze over solid. So we had only had a few days of tracking these fish, and we went out one day to do it, and the entire bay was frozen solid. So we couldn't go out on the boat. So what we did was we waited a few more days for the ice to build up, and when the ice was thick enough to walk on safely, we took the radio antenna out, and we just hiked around on the bay over the ice trying to hear some fish. So unfortunately, we never heard any fish through the ice, but it was our last ditch effort to hear them that year. So that's where that photo came from, and I just love that photo. But usually now we've moved on to some other methods since then. What we do now, and what I'm getting ready for in the next month or so, is sampling cisco when they come back into Chameau Bay to spawn. So they should be starting to come back into the bay around late November, like around Thanksgiving time, and then the males come in first, and then the females will come in a little bit later, and they spawn in the first week or two of December. And it's usually right before the bay freezes over, so it's really cold, it's really snowy, the weather is often really terrible, but that is when they spawn. So this is a great picture of us catching the fish in the fall, and we use trap nets, which are a method that catches the fish without killing them, which is really nice because we can take measurements, take fin clip samples for genetics, take a scale sample, and then put them back in the lake, and they can spawn and go about their business. So we set these trap nets out on these shallow rocky areas where they like to spawn, and we leave them overnight. And then the next day we come back and check them, and hopefully they're full of fish. And then we pull the fish out, and we separate them into males and females, and then some of each group of both males and females are taken to the USGS, that's U.S. Geological Survey's Tunison Lab, which is a hatchery that raises cisco for restoration, and the rest we take various samples on. We measure their total length, which is their nose to the tip of their tail. We measure their weight. We take a fin clip sample, which is a tissue sample for genetics. And that's a picture of the one of the ciscos in what we call a science hammock, which is a foam, like a soft foam pad that we've cut a cisco-shaped hole out of, and then we cover it with like a chamois type material that's wet, so they get to laze around in the cisco hammock while they get all of their science workup done. And then after we do length, weight, fin clip sample, some of them get tagged. So we are still tagging fish with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but we've moved to acoustic tags. So those are tags that are surgically implanted in the belly of the fish. And those will last about 2 years, and each one has a unique ID number. So that fish with the tag will swim around, and it'll ping every second or so. And we have receivers, acoustic receivers, spread out around the eastern side of Lake Ontario. And if any of the fish come near our receivers, their little tag will ping, and the receiver will pick it up. And then at the end of the year, we can download the data and see where all of our fish have been swimming around in the lake. So that's part of what we're doing too. So that's all the stuff that we do in the fall during spawning with the adult fish. The other thing that I do is I sample eggs with egg mats. And a big part of my project is trying to figure out where the Cisco are depositing their eggs. They we just showed the video too of them getting released. I keep talking.
I always got to show them like going back into the wild and being happy and everything.
Yes, they go back in the wild. Yep. I love that video. They're like, get out of here. So a big part of my project though is looking at where the Cisco are laying their eggs. The fish in Chameau Bay tend to spawn on these really shallow, rocky areas in the bay, and the shallowest part that I found eggs is only about 4 feet deep. So they can come into really shallow water and lay their eggs on these big rocks. So these egg mats are metal frames, and I wrap furnace filter, hogshair furnace filter around them, and then we have them strung into strings of 3. And those lay on the bottom, and then when the Cisco spawn, the eggs float down and then settle into the mat. And if we pull the mat up, we can pick the eggs out and count them and see how many there are. We can also save eggs and hatch them out in the lab if we're interested in seeing the little baby fish that hatch out. And a lot of times I save eggs for genetics to make sure that what we're getting is Cisco eggs and not lake whitefish eggs, which look almost identical. And lake whitefish spawn about 2 weeks before Cisco. So we want to make sure that we're not getting any overlap on Cisco and whitefish spawn timing. So a big part of my research right now is looking all over the eastern basin of Lake Ontario and trying to figure out if there's any other places in the eastern basin that Cisco are spawning. Because there's the one location that we know of in Chameau Bay. And there's similar habitat. There's that similar shallow rocky habitat all around the eastern basin, but we haven't gotten any reports of Cisco actually spawning there. So I identified all of these different areas that have shallow rocks, and what I'm doing this fall is going out and putting mats down in those areas and hopefully getting some Cisco eggs. And if we do get Cisco eggs, that's great news because that means there's another spawning population we didn't know about. And if we don't get Cisco eggs, but we do find nice habitat, then those areas could be potential sites for restoration in the future, or stocking, or some other sort of restoration effort.
Great. Yeah, it's always interesting to see that. Now, do you do any like when you're raising them? What do you do after that? Do you keep some of them to be able to research, or are you just releasing them all out into the wild to like help restore the population? Like what's the process with all of that?
Sure. So the eggs that we take from the fish in the fall are sent to the USGS Tunison laboratory in Cortland, New York, and they're the ones that will raise the eggs into little fingerling or yearling Cisco. They have a big hatchery facility where they can raise I think they've done usually about 10,000 Cisco, and each year to stock back into the lake. They have been stocking them in some of the places where they used to spawn, but are not currently known to spawn. So far they've stocked them in Irondequoit Bay, which is near Rochester, New York. They've also stocked them in Sodus Bay and in Sandy Pond. So they are working on growing these fish up to put them back in the lake. So hopefully they grow nice and big, and a few years later come back and spawn and spread the population out over the eastern basin.
Now, are you just sampling just for the adult Cisco and the eggs, or are you doing any other sampling as well, of any other like areas of their life cycle?
Sure, yeah. Eggs and adults, both important, but there's stages in between that are important as well. A lot of the work that I did, especially for my master's research, was on the larval fish. So once they hatch out of the eggs in the spring, what do they do? What do they eat? Where do they go? So Cisco are kind of interesting because a lot of fish species in the Great Lakes will lay their eggs in the spring, and then the baby fish hatch out pretty soon afterwards. But Cisco lay them in the fall, and then the eggs sit under the ice all winter long for several months, and then hatch out in April or early May, right as the ice is starting to break up along the shore. And this is nice because they grow a little bit bigger than a lot of other baby fish, and they're also out earlier, so that might give them some sort of leg up on eating zooplankton and growing big. So in the spring, I'll go out and go netting for larval fish, and we use these big nets that are called bongo nets, and they're called bongo nets because they look like bongo drums. They're two triangular nets on a frame, and we tow them around behind the boat, and that'll pick up any cisco larvae in the area that we find. We're using this not only to try to figure out how many of these cisco eggs are surviving and hatching, we're also trying to figure out what they eat. And we're also using it as a tool to try to see if there's any other populations around the lake that we don't know of. Because even if we can't find eggs, in the spring we might be able to find larvae, and then we can hopefully narrow down where nearby there might be eggs. So the larvae are a really critical life stage for fish. A lot of larvae hatch out, but not a lot survive. And the number that survives can determine how good of a year class you get later. And so there's a lot of factors that go into larval survival. Obviously, they are tiny and soft and slow moving compared to a big fish. So a lot of fish eat larvae. Larvae also have to make sure that there also has to be food for them to eat. So especially cisco, they hatch out so early, sometimes there's not enough zooplankton around for them to eat. So we do a lot of work looking at diets. One really cool result that is a preliminary result that we got, but we're working on expanding this into a bigger study, is when we looked at the diets of our larval cisco from a couple of years ago, there were a lot of zooplankton in there, but we also found microplastic in their stomachs. So about 42% of the larval cisco we had plastic microfibers in their stomachs. So we're not really sure what that means. We don't know if they're choosing to eat those or if they just happen to eat them accidentally as they're eating zooplankton, but that's almost half of the larvae that had plastic in their stomachs. So that's still worrisome. And I think plastic contamination and microplastic pollution in the Great Lakes is something that people are really starting to think about and are starting to get more interested in. And so hopefully we'll figure out how they're affecting the fish community as well, especially in these native fish species that we're trying to restore.
Yeah, it definitely does seem to be becoming more of a buzzword of things that you're hearing about in the Great Lakes, is that whole microplastic issue there. And so it's definitely going to be very interesting to see how much it is impacting native species like the cisco, because you would think, it's going to fill up their stomach, they're not going to feel as full, but they're not getting, the nutrients, or they, spending that time, all that energy going in after that when it's not going to give them anything. I mean, there's just so much that, just consuming or attempting to consume those microplastics is going to do to those fish that...
Yeah. Exactly. I think that's an area that needs a lot more research in the Great Lakes, and luckily people are starting to get interested in that. Yeah,
for sure. It's like I said, I've been hearing a lot more about it, so it'll be interesting to see the results that you get out of that for sure. Yeah. So we're starting to come to a close here with our time, and so I can't let this question slip by because I have a feeling Titus would be very upset if I did. But what's your favorite cisco recipe?
Yeah, I saw you ask that earlier, Titus, and if Nicole didn't ask it, I was going to answer it. Cisco are delicious. We talk about, we want to bring back the fishery, we want to bring back the native species, but also they're tasty. So
hey, that's a win for me. I'm always about bringing back food, fish that are good to eat. Any sort of animal out there that's good to eat, I'm like, I'm all for that. Let's bring it back.
Yeah, we want more of these around.
Yes.
Cisco are great to eat, and they are really healthy. They're really high in omega-3 fatty acids. They have about the same level of fatty acids as salmon do. And they're also pretty low in contaminants because they eat zooplankton. So they're lower on the food web. So in some areas of the Great Lakes where contaminants like mercury or PCBs are an issue, cisco are often pretty low in those contaminants. So there's a study done a few years ago on the North Shore of Minnesota that showed that women who switched from eating more lake trout and walleye to more Cisco were able to significantly reduce the level of mercury that they had in their bodies. So Cisco are very healthy and very tasty. I think my favorite way to eat Cisco is smoked, which is the classic way to eat them. I just love smoked fish. I had such a great time at that meeting up in Bayfield, Wisconsin, because I have never eaten so much smoked fish in my life. So thank you, Wisconsin. It was just wonderful. Everywhere I went, there was smoked fish, smoked herring, and I brought a lot of smoked herring back in my luggage. And then when I got back, all my laundry smelled like herring. So it was great.
But totally worth it though, right?
Totally worth it. Yeah. And as a Cisco biologist, I love the smell of smoked herring. So I thought it was great. I like it smoked. The other way though, that I really like it, and that is a really kind of a local delicacy, is to eat the caviar. So the eggs are a lot of people that eat Cisco in the Great Lakes area mostly eat the flesh, the meat, and you can smoke it or you grill it or any other way that you would normally cook a fish. But the caviar is also really good, and it's often called golden caviar or Superior Gold up around Lake Superior. But most of the caviar that's comes from Cisco in Lake Superior is actually shipped to Sweden, and it's a major export from that fishery into Sweden because the Cisco caviar is a delicacy there, and their native stocks of whitefish and Cisco are very low. So Lake Superior supplies most of the Cisco caviar to Sweden, and I had a very bizarre experience when I was in Sweden a few years ago. I went to a restaurant with a family member of mine that lives there, and she's like, "Oh, you have to order this. It's so good. It's this local delicacy and very special." And so I ordered it, and it was cod that had been cooked in milk with some horseradish and lingonberries and potatoes, and on top of it was Cisco caviar. And she's like, "Oh, I'm sure you don't have this there in the U.S." And I'm like, "I know what this stuff is. Like, I've been covered with this stuff during spawning season." It was delicious, and I loved it. So it's hard to find it outside of the immediate Lake Superior area, but I know you can order it online. And if you are near Lake Superior during the winter, which is when it's most available, I would recommend you try some golden caviar, Cisco caviar.
Great. So like if we can order online, then we don't necessarily have to send you with that extra suitcase that Titus was talking about to bring us all back, delicious.
Yes, exactly.
So
I would totally stuff a suitcase full of Cisco. Smoked fish.
Are there like any festivals or anything up there about Cisco of where you can like try all the different ways that people will cook it or anything? Is there like any fun festivals that a scientist or the public can go and just experiment with? Because that's always the thing I love with festivals, and where they've got it based around like a certain species or whatever. There's so many different dishes that you can try. Do you know of any that any places around that have that?
That's a great question, and I actually am not personally aware of any. So if anyone out there knows of any Cisco, lake herring, Tula beef festivals out there, that would be amazing, and I would want to go on a trip to see them.
I would go right along with you because that sounds amazing.
I do know that there's quite a bit of a tourist trade and tourist draw to go to the North Shore in Lake Superior and around Minnesota and Wisconsin, and eating the local fish caught there is a big tourist draw. But I don't know of any specific events. So if anyone knows of them, send them along.
Well, maybe if there isn't one, maybe we should get you to start one so we could all go and hang out and try everything.
I would do that, and then we could have like a smoked Cisco contest, and then I would volunteer to taste all of them.
Can I also volunteer to be a judge?
Yes.
I'll put my hand up for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Titus is saying that Burbot have a festival, so you would think Cisco would have one. So yeah, I mean, if there's not one,
Yeah.
let's get on like doing it. I think that would be not only just fun for all of us, anyways, but I think it would be a great way to do some outreach to people as well. So and a fun
It
way to do
would.
outreach as well. So
Yeah, that would be a great way to do outreach. Anything that connects people to their natural resources, connects people to the native fish in the area is a great opportunity.
great. Well, I'll leave you with that so that way you can start planning that. But no, seriously, any like last thoughts of things that you want everyone to know about Cisco that we haven't, necessarily covered in the last hour? Any last thoughts to
Yeah,
leave them with?
absolutely. I guess we covered the major one, which is Cisco exists.
Yes.
They're here. And they're really important to the ecosystem. But I guess the last thing I would want to say is Cisco are one of those fish that I guess depending on where you live, Lake Superior definitely different, but in the lower lakes, Cisco are one of those kind of forgotten fish. They're one of the native fish species that doesn't get a lot of love, doesn't get a lot of press. There's a lot of focus on Chinook salmon and Pacific salmon, alewife, rainbow smelt. But the fact of the matter is we can't really have healthy functioning lakes if we don't also have these native fish species. So even though species like Cisco, whitefish, burbot, all of these other species don't get a lot of airtime, they're very important to the health of the Great Lakes. And I think that the reason we want to bring these species back is because we want the Great Lakes to stay healthy and sustainable in the future. And without a healthy native species population, that's going to be a lot harder.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you, Ellen, for coming on Scicomm Monday. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully everyone was able to learn a little bit about Cisco, and we'll go out and give it a good taste, so that way they'll be that much more excited about bringing them back, because it's always good to help bring our native species back to the Great Lakes, especially since we've been so impacted by so many different things here in the Great Lakes, from invasive species to anthropogenic impacts. It just seems like one thing after another. So anything we can do to help bring native species back I'm all on board for that. So
good. Absolutely. Show the Great Lakes some love and go catch a Cisco.
Great. Well,
yeah.
If you want to get a hold of Ellen, if you had questions that we didn't get to today, or you're watching this on replay, please definitely tweet her at Great Lakes Cisco. And if you want to just find out information about the upcoming festival, Cisco 2018, we're going to make this happen. I tell you, we're going to make this happen. Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely feel free to tweet her. If you've got any questions for myself, feel free to tweet me either at the broadcast Twitter handle of Scicomm Monday or at my personal handle of Wildlife BioGal. And just a note that next week we're going to be off. It's I'm turning another year older next week, so I'm going to be out celebrating with family and friends on that day. So
happy birthday!
Thank you. So we're going to have a good time. So we're gonna be off for that day, going and seeing what trouble we can get to around the greater Michigan area with everyone. So definitely we'll be back in November with more broadcasts with a lot of great and interesting scientists from around the world. So tune in for those upcoming broadcasts. And then for everything else, we just want to make sure we send some thank yous out to everyone who supports us on Scicomm Monday here. It's definitely a big bonus to be able to have our Patreon supporters out there who give so much to help make this broadcast happen every week. And then a special thank you goes out to Jason Leathers. He goes by I4MSU on Twitter. He's one of our major Patreon sponsors, and we want to give him some extra love out there with his help with everything. And if you really like the broadcast and like what we're doing here, please go out to our Patreon site and help support the broadcast. Any little bit definitely helps us out here, from getting new equipment to make sure things happen, such as today when we found out one of our apps wasn't working properly and we had to quickly download. If we had everything working, to the fact that my tripod that I always use for our broadcast randomly broke right before the broadcast. To be able to replace those things, it definitely helps. And then also just the time and effort to be able to go and do this, to be able to go out and do our Fieldwork Live series where we can actually see science live that's happening. I mean, it'd be great if we could go out and hang out with Ellen while she's catching those Cisco, and so we can show you that science live as it happens. All that funding from the Patreon account goes into all those different initiatives there. And then we've also started a a GoFundMe project. So with Patreon, it's a monthly donation, but with the GoFundMe, it's just a one-time donation. So we know some people are a little bit more comfortable with just doing a one-time donation. So please go out and visit our GoFundMe site for our fall 2017 campaign here for Scicomm Monday. And if you're a scientist or a Scicommer and you want to be on Scicomm Monday, please contact us, direct message us, and we'll talk to you about getting you on the broadcast at some point in time. We've talked to so many different amazing scientists and Scicommers from all around the world, everywhere from Australia to Europe and everywhere in between, and covering so many different types of science. So if you're out there and you want to come on, just like Ellen did today, and talk about your work, we'd love to have you on. And with that, we just want to tell everyone, thank you for tuning in today, and go out, explore, do some science, have some fun, and we'll see you on the next Scicomm Monday.